Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Fred Fox School of Music. We ask that you take a moment to turn off any electronic devices so as not to distract from this evening's performance. Please note, due to copyright restrictions, audio and video recording are not permitted. Thank you, and enjoy the performance.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining the performers and me here and on the live stream for my lecture recital this evening. This lecture and recital are a presentation of research that will become my terminal document. The terminal document and its submission to the Graduate College constitutes the final step of my doctoral studies at the University of Arizona. Title: Madrigal Comedy, the broader choral context for early opera. Intent and scope of study. Scholars disagree regarding whether the genre of madrigal comedy is a precursor to opera, a culmination of madrigalian form, or some other independent musical genre. However, there has been little direct comparison of Orazio Vecchi's madrigal comedies and the earliest operas. For my study, I will compare the madrigal comedy L'Amphi Parnasso, with music and libretto by Orazio Vecchi, with the premiere version of Ottavio Rinuccini's Euridice, with music by Jacopo Peri and Giulio Caccini, based on the Orpheus stories in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Both Peri and Caccini composed and published full operatic settings of Rinuccini's libretto, but the premiere performance mostly featured music by Peri. Caccini, however, required that his own music be substituted when his students, who portrayed the title character, and certain members of the chorus were singing, resulting in a hybrid of the two standalone operas. This comparison between L'Amphi Parnasso and Euridice is to show that madrigal comedy is an important precursor to opera for reasons not previously addressed. I will also consider pieces composed for the Concerto della Donne by both Vecchi and Giovanni de Bardi. Bardi was one of the composers typically associated with the Florentine Camerata. The Concerto della Donne was a group of professional musicians in the Este Court of Ferrara. The group was typically made up of 4 women who sang and played for private audiences. They were particularly renowned for their expressive abilities and excellent text delivery. These works will be considered because the practices of the Concerto della Donne directly influenced the development of performance traditions in both Euridice and L'Amphi Parnasso. I will analyze the works with regard to poetic structure, setting of speech rhythm, texture, dramatic roles, and text painting. Multiple musicological sources perpetuate the once dominant idea that the Florentine Camerata was a single entity that was unilaterally responsible for the development of opera and whose membership included Giovanni de Bardi, Girolamo May, Vincenzo Galilei, Giulio Caccini, Ottavio Rinuccini, Emilio de Cavalieri, Jacopo Peri, and occasionally Jacopo Corsi. This is a misconception that remains prominent, especially among opera-going audiences and those who convey this history without access to more recent scholarship. The many individuals who are commonly associated with the term Florentine Camerata constitute at least 2 separate intellectual circles, one associated with Bardi and the other with Corsi. Corsi's role in the development of opera has been well established, but it is not appropriately or accurately communicated in many music history textbooks, especially older texts. Claude V. Poliska has identified the following: inconsistent application of the term Florentine Camerata, the disparate timelines of participation by various individuals in the 2 circles, and the geographical and philosophical divide between the groups associated with Bardi and Corsi. The importance of the madrigal, both as a musical and poetic genre to Peri's Euridice and to early opera as a whole, is well documented by modern scholars. Yet, in the last 20 years, scholars have posited that madrigal comedy, which is arguably the first dramatic art form to utilize the musical madrigal for the purpose of presenting a complete narrative, is solely a choral genre and not related to opera. Currently, the dominant narrative is that the stile rappresentativo, which to modern ears sounds like recitative, is the defining characteristic that distinguishes opera from other sung narrative genres. And that intermedio, which included stile rappresentativo singing, is the sole progenitor of Italian opera. As with any genre, however, a number of factors and influences can contribute to the emergence of a new art form. In this study, I examine the shared origins of opera and madrigal comedy and how consideration of these shared origins can help recontextualize the intersections of these two genres. To support my thesis, I will show the clear link between Orazio Vecchi's madrigal comedy, Parnasso, and the earliest operas. My argument includes consideration of the association between the composers involved, their shared connection with the Concerto della Donne, and their common links to the Este courts. I will also compare musical and dramatic aspects of the two works, including text treatment, melody, rhythm, and harmony, as well as character representation, plot continuity, and chorus function. The period of time I will consider is 1573, the earliest meeting of the Bardi Circle, to 1605, the year of Orazio Vecchi's death. Statement of primary thesis. Madrigal comedy is an important genre in the history of Western music. Traditionally, madrigal comedy has been considered a forerunner of opera. More recently, based on information regarding performance traditions and narrative content, some scholars have argued that madrigal comedy is more appropriately considered a choral genre. Madrigal comedy, particularly Parnasso, does have an important place in the development of choral music. However, it remains an important precursor to opera not only because of the common origins and Vecchi's acknowledged influence on early opera composers, but also because of shared approaches to dramatic storytelling. Relevant persons. Orazio Vecchi was born in Modena and baptized in December of 1550. He was born to Giovanni de Vecchi and Isabetta Garuti, who provided financial support for Orazio. His early life is not well documented until after he joined the priesthood and began traveling. But it is likely that he completed ecclesiastical training at San Pietro in Modena by 1577. Over the next 2 years, he traveled to Bergamo, Brescia, and likely to Venice, where his first book of motets was published by Angelo Gardano. From 1581 to 1586, he held multiple positions as maestro di cappella. First at the Salo Cathedral to the northeast of Brescia for 3 years, then the Modena Cathedral, and then at the more lucrative Reggio Emilia Cathedral for only a few months, before becoming a canon at the Correggio Cathedral, where he was later promoted to archdeacon and served in that capacity from 1591 to 1593. From early on in Vecchi's career, he was involved in multiple collaborations with other esteemed composers. In 1579, he was one of 6 composers whose works were included in a collection published in honor of the marriage of Grand Duke of Tuscany, Francisco I de' Medici, to Bianca Capello. In 1582 and 1583, his works were included in 2 large collections composed for the Concerto della Donne of the Este Court and in honor of one of its members, Laura Peverara. In 1591, he was one of 3 composers chosen to revise a Gardano publication of the Roman Gradual in response to changes to the Roman Missal. He returned to the Modena Cathedral in 1593, serving again as Maestro di Cappella before receiving a benefice and a title change that did not considerably change his duties in 1596. The following year, he went again to Venice to publish a considerable backlog of works with Gardano, including his Sacrarum, Cancionum Liber Secundus, Canzonet for 3 voices, and Il Convito Musicale for 3 to 8 voices. Il Convito was particularly important because it included every extant Italian secular musical form of the time. It also included a new edition of Fumo Felice un Tempo from the 1582 collection for the Concerto della Donne. This trip also saw the publication of his tour de force madrigal comedy, L'Amphi Parnasso. In 1598, Duke Cesare d'Este appointed Vecchi Maestro di Corte in Modena. He served in this role before traveling to Rome with Alessandro d'Este, who had become a cardinal. Later that year, he also heard the premiere of a Eurydice in Florence at the wedding festivities of Henri IV and Maria de' Medici. In 1603, he was offered a position in the court of Emperor Rudolph II, but he had to decline because of poor health. He died in Modena in 1605. The Florentine Camerata is first named in the dedication of Giulio Caccini's version of Le Eurydice, published in 1600, and again in the preface to Le Nuove Musiche, published in 1602. The importance of these two publications, especially Nuove Musiche, led to the popular usage of the term after Nuove Musiche found a new audience long after his death. Caccini was born in Rome in 1551. As a youth, he sang treble in the Cappella Julia at St. Peter's Basilica, notably between Palestrina's terms as director of the ensemble. By 1565, he was recruited to Florence to sing for the wedding celebration of Prince Francesco de' Medici and Johanna of Austria. He would remain in Florence, where he studied singing, presumably during the process of his voice change, and became a tenor employed by the Medici court. He worked as a singer and as a teacher of singing, and eventually came under the patronage of Giovanni de' Bardi. Their first extant correspondence was a letter in which Bardi expounds on ancient music and good singing. Caccini traveled with Bardi to hear the Concerto della Donne at the Este Court in Ferrara, and returned from that trip in possession of multiple madrigals in the Ferrarese style. He worked for Bardi even after Bardi lost political popularity in Florence. He went with Bardi to Rome in 1592 to serve as his secretary, but he traveled between Rome, Ferrara, and Florence, where he finally settled. Caccini was able to collaborate with the artists who congregated around the younger Jacopo Corsi, though he still maintained financial ties to Bardi. Giovanni de' Bardi was born in 1534 to a prominent family, which would ultimately yield him the inherited title of Count of Vernio. But he found success through his military achievements and his close association with Grand Duke Francesco I de' Medici. He had a wide range of interests and opened his home in Florence to young noblemen so they could observe conversations between older nobility about many topics, including literature, science, music, and antiquities. While still active in the military, he began sponsoring Vincenzo Galilei, an accomplished lutenist who was around 10 years older than Bardi, though his exact date of birth is uncertain. Bardi urged Galilei to go to Venice to study theory and counterpoint under Josefo Zarlino, who had published one of the foremost treatises on both the theory and practice of composition. In 1572, Galilei wrote to the humanist and Greek historian Girolamo Mei. Mei was a Florentine who began his career as an assistant editor for Greek tragedies and Greek philosophical works. He had been studying Greek music for the past 2 decades when Galilei made contact and had further focused on the Greek system of musical modes since securing a position in Rome in 1561. Letters between Mei and Galilei were deeply influential to Bardi. While the philosophy of the group had shifted away from modern music toward a glorification of ancient style that emphasized text and could, allegedly, move the senses, members of Bardi's circle, including Bardi himself, continued to write polyphonic vocal music. While Caccini and Galilei were the two primary composers who met regularly in Bardi's home, there were many men representing other fields in frequent attendance, including poets, Giovanni Battista Guarini, Gabriello Chiabrera, Giovanni Battista Strozzi, and Alessandro Rinuccini, Ottavio's older brother. Philologists, Marcello Adriani and Leonardo Salviati, and literary theorist Lorenzo Giacomini. While the mythos surrounding the Florentine Camerata has given the illusion of being the birthplace of opera, the overwhelming majority of individuals regularly present in Bardi's home were primarily concerned with philosophical and theoretical ideas. And these gatherings yielded very little actual music. The nearest practical example of Bardi's musical ideas is in the intermedi that accompanied the play La Pellegrina in honor of the 1589 marriage between Grand Duke Ferdinand I de' Medici and Christine de Lorraine. These intermedi, however, included collaborators more associated with the Medicis than Bardi himself, and they were a far cry from opera. In stark contrast, the circle around Jacopo Corsi was focused primarily on the composition of new text and music and the performance thereof. Corsi was able to fill the role of artistic patron in Bardi's absence for financial, practical, and political reasons. Corsi was heir to a considerable fortune and maintained his familial wealth. Therefore, he was able to fully sponsor productions of new works. Although Corsi was a member of and took interest in the Accademia degli Alterati, a formalized literary academy that contained many of the members of Bardi's circle, he was a skilled harpsichordist, and he was primarily focused on producing performances that synthesized text and music. When Grand Duke Francesco I de' Medici died in 1587, his brother, Grand Duke Ferdinand I de' Medici, who was previously a cardinal, looked unfavorably upon and even dismissed some in the court who had endorsed the wedding of Francesco to Bianca Capello because of the scandalous circumstances surrounding her previous marriage. Despite this, Bardi was still asked to direct the intermedi in honor of the 1589 Medici-Lorraine marriage. Even before Bardi's diminished political status in Florence, 23-year-old Corsi received a dedication from Vincenzo Galilei in his 1584 republication of Phronimo, a guide to vocal music on the lute. In 1592, after Bardi's departure to Rome, Corsi was able to open his home to some of the musicians and poets who previously frequented Bardi's residence. He also attracted those who took part in the Intermedi of 1589, but were not part of Bardi's circle. Two such artists were Ottavio Rinuccini, who wrote most of the text of the 1589 Intermedi, and Jacopo Peri, who composed and sung his own aria in the performance. Peri had already established himself from a young age as a talented singer and organist. His first work was published when he was just 16, and he was appointed organist at the Badia Fiorentina at 17. He had already contributed music for a set of intermedi in 1583 and even accompanied himself on stage in one of the intermedio in 1589. Corsi, Rinuccini, and Peri collaborated on the pastoral drama Daphne, first performed during the Carnival season before Lent in 1598. If the music survived, this may have been considered the first opera, or maybe an opera by modern scholars. The trio was able to remount Daphne for Carnival in early 1600. Later that year, Corsi produced a Eurydice, with music mostly by Peri and text by Rinuccini as a wedding present to Maria de' Medici at the festivities of her marriage, by proxy, to the King of France, Henri IV. Caccini required that his own musical settings of the text be inserted when his students were singing. Emilio de Cavalieri, the Roman composer who replaced Bardi in the Florentine Medici court, also contributed students to the performance, but he did not make the same demands. It was shortly after the performance, with the publication of complete scores by Peri and Caccini, that a first opera became cemented in history. Even though Peri's complete score was almost certainly completed before Caccini's, Caccini rushed to have his version published before Peri. Neither composer was able to finish editions before the publication of Cavalieri's oratorio, Rappresentazione di Anima e di Corpo, which included a similar style of speech-like singing that Cavalieri had experimented with in earlier intermedi. Peri acknowledged Cavalieri's contributions in his preface to A Eurydice. Caccini did not. The still popular belief that a single and unified Florentine camerata was responsible for the birth of opera in Italy ignores multiple streams throughout the Italian peninsula that would lead toward opera in the next century. This belief necessarily positions Cavalieri's contributions as either part of the greater Florentine camerata or considers oratorio to be a separate entity entirely. Perhaps the most problematic element of the myth of a Florentine camerata is the de-emphasis of the performers whose subtleties of interpretation made possible the effects intended by poets and composers. Performers like those of the Concerto della Donne. The Concerto della Donne was preceded by a group of singing noblewomen who were active in the Ferrarese court throughout the 1570s. But once Duke Alfonso II married his third wife, the 15-year-old, music-loving Margherita Gonzaga, he invited 4 women into the court for the express purpose of singing for private company and distinguished guests. And they were present from 1580 to 1597. It was practically unheard of at the time to retain a group of professional female singers. The cornerstone of the ensemble was Peverara from Mantua, and she was joined by Anna Guarini, Livia d'Arco, and finally Tarquina Molza. Alfonso retained a bass singer as well, Giulio Cesare Brancaccio, who had joined the singing noblewomen in the late 1570s. The concerto was particularly adept in their singing of diminutions, and the singers performed in any arrangement, from individual soloists to polyphonic ensemble, both unaccompanied and accompanied, with instruments. News of their abilities traveled quickly, spread by those who were lucky enough to be invited into the private performances. Bardi remarked how well they sang every syllable, though he did not utilize their skills of conveying text and polyphony when he later composed for the group. Their skill in performance and interpretation influenced many prominent composers, and they were responsible for some of the most important developments of secular music around the end of the 16th century. This impacted not only opera, but concerted madrigals and madrigal comedy as well. It is these types of performers and musical currents that are lost in the haze of the Florentine camerata. Review of scholarly literature. The sources that were valuable for the study fall into the following categories. Sources that provide historical information about the musicians and their benefactors, original sources and translations of documents with commentaries, including scores and treatises, and articles, dissertations, and textbooks regarding madrigal comedy, opera, and other Italian secular genres. Synopsis of the 2 works. Eurydice. Eurydice begins with a prologue celebrating the joining of Orfeo and Eurydice. The prologue is delivered by Tragedy, who tells that there will be, in fact, no tragedy, but only happiness and love. A detail from Ovid that is excluded by Rinuccini is that Hymen, the Greek god of marriage, comes to the wedding, but is unable to provide the regular blessing. Eurydice and her companions, nymphs and shepherds, are singing and dancing, and they frolic away, excited about the marriage, before Orfeo and his companions arrive. The newlyweds are celebrating separately from each other while they await their wedding night. Orfeo enters the meadow after everyone has left. He sings of his unending happiness that began with his marriage to Eurydice. Orfeo and Arcetro, a shepherd, discuss how the pains of Orfeo's past have now been overcome by hope, as Arcetro foretold. Another shepherd, Tirsi, joins the discussion. Daphne enters distressed but unable to share her news. After considerable urging by Arcetro and Orfeo, she finally tells them that Eurydice was bitten by a snake and died. Orfeo is in shock over the death of his bride. The nymphs return with Aminta, the third shepherd. They confirm Daphne's story and lament together as Orfeo leaves. Arcetro follows Orfeo and then returns to the nymphs, telling them that Orfeo went to the place of Eurydice's death and was taken away on Venus's chariot to retrieve Eurydice's soul from the underworld. Act 2 begins at the gates of the underworld, where Orfeo entrances Charon, the boatman of the river Styx, Pluto, the god of the underworld, and Proserpina, Pluto's wife and goddess of the underworld, with his singing and lyre playing. Orfeo convinces Pluto to let him go into the underworld to retrieve Eurydice's soul. The gods of the underworld, Chorus 1, are joined by Chorus 2. They sing about Orfeo's triumph in getting to the underworld, as well as how hard it will be for him to return to the world of the living with Eurydice. Peri's and Caccini's audience would have known that Eurydice's soul was lost on the journey home in Ovid's version. Back in the meadow, Archetro and other nymphs and shepherds await the news of Orfeo's return. Aminta shares that the couple has returned alive. To everyone's delight, Orfeo and Eurydice enter the meadow. Eurydice confirms that she is alive and that Orfeo saved her. He explains that he saved her with his powers of music, and the chorus celebrates Orfeo's triumph. Parnasso. Parnasso takes place in Italy and features stock characters from the Commedia dell'arte and a scenario common to this dramatic genre. The characters typically include two pairs of young lovers, one or two rich old men, one egotistical and powerful younger man, and an indefinite number of servants and other low-status characters, classified as and sometimes named Zani. The prologue of Parnasso is delivered by Lelio, one of the young lovers, who explains that this drama is meant to be heard and not seen, as unlike other comedies and tragedies. In the first scene, Pantalone, the old man, tells his servant Pedronino, also referred to as Pierolin, to call on the courtesan Hortensia, with whom the old man is enamored. Hortensia denies Pantalone's advances and taunts him. He is annoyed by her and says he will not go to bed with her the next time she is in the mood. In the second scene, the first pair of young lovers, Lelio and Nisa, are introduced. Lelio doubts that Nisa truly loves him. In the third scene, the old and hard of hearing Dr. Graziano asks Pantalone for his daughter's hand in marriage. Typically, one of the women of the two pairs of young lovers would be Pantalone's daughter, but neither Nisa nor Isabella reference it directly in their dialogue. Pantalone agrees to allow Graziano to marry his daughter, but Graziano does not believe it at first. The second act begins with another young lover, Lucio, standing on a cliff, ready to throw himself into a chasm, because he thinks his love, Isabella, loves another, Captain Cardone. Captain Cardone, a Spanish captain of the occupying military, tries to talk to Zani, who is from Bergamo. Zani speaks a dialect that Cardone does not understand. Zani thinks that Cardone is speaking Portuguese. Cardone is finally able to communicate that he wants Zani to knock on Isabella's door. Isabella answers the door, and Zani is excused. Isabella pretends to love Cardone, but she begins the scene by playing a joke, accusing him of not being true to her, in order to elicit his declaration of singular devotion. She privately hopes that if she dies, his grief will cause him to stop his warring ways. At his urging, she says every part of her belongs to him, but the music reveals that her true intentions to deceive him to the audience. Once Cardone leaves, Isabella laments Lucio's supposed death, which she learns of without being told on stage, and pulls out a dagger to end her life. She begins to thrust the knife into herself, but Frula, Lucio's servant, stops her hand. Frula tells her that Lucio is alive. He tells her that Lucio was prevented from jumping by some onlookers. Isabella chooses to live now that she knows her true love is alive. In Act 3, the marriage contract between Pantalone and Graziano has been sealed, and Pantalone has put money toward the dowry. He tells a servant of his, Francotrippa, to invite Pantalone's relatives. The merry Graziano approaches, and Pantalone suggests that he sing a madrigal to his bride-to-be. Francotrippa summons the daughter to the balcony, unheard. Graziano sings under the balcony, and Pantalone is impressed. Francotrippa tells them that the bride wants them to go inside. Francotrippa goes to a Jewish home, or possibly a synagogue, to pawn something for a loan, likely to pay for a wedding present that he is unable to give in the final scene. Muddled, Hebrew-sounding words come from behind the door. Francotrippa is frustrated because he has trouble understanding the speakers through the closed door, and they refuse to do business with him on the Sabbath. In the final setting, Lucio and Isabella stumble upon each other. They promise their unending love for each other and see Lelio approaching. Lucio tells Lelio about their union and tells him to get the guests for his wedding. Lucio welcomes the guests and tells them each to give a gift. Each then presents Isabella with a gift. They all go inside for the wedding, and Lucio speaks to the wedding guests and the actual audience and encourages them to applaud for the end of the piece. Similarities and differences. It is helpful to consider an overview of the genres madrigal comedy and opera as they were understood by the composers and librettists in this study. These genres were in their infancy at the end of the 16th centuries, and these composers and librettists, of course, had no concept of the performance traditions that would develop out of their works. They were creating fully sung dramas, and specific labels for them would not come until decades or centuries later. Madrigal comedy and opera have in common that they are vocal genres and feature no spoken dialogue. The texts for them are necessarily shorter than those of spoken works, since sung delivery takes more time. They both have a discrete plot with characters and circumstances that develop throughout the story. They both feature multiple poetic and musical forms in addition to madrigal within a single work. Most importantly, they share theatrical and vocal origins. They both draw on elements from pastoral theater and other theatrical traditions of the late 16th century. They also share a common model for vocalism and ornamentation in the Concerto della Donne. There are notable differences between the two genres as well. The two most substantive differences are the performing forces and production considerations. For example, Vecchi uses multiple voices to represent a single character, whereas Peri and others use an individual singer to represent each character. Peri expected his operas to be elaborately staged and costumed, whereas Vecchi focused on the oral experience of his madrigal comedies, foregoing visual components in performance. As mentioned, the first and most obvious similarity is that madrigal comedies by Vecchi and the operas by Peri and Caccini are fully sung. More importantly, though, there is a continuous and self-contained plot within that sung music. Contemporaneous audiences would have been familiar with specific stories and dramatic conventions, which allowed for librettists to cut portions of the stories from the musical settings. In the preface of L'Amphi Parnasso, Vecchi explains that for the sake of brevity, he omitted dialogue that would be present in a spoken version of the story. One example of this is that there is no scene where Lucio, Isabella's true love, is specifically told that Captain Cardone is in love with her. Vecchi specifically states that those familiar with theatrical convention would understand these omissions. Unlike Vecchi, Rinuccini does not explicitly state that one must be familiar with the source material to follow the drama, but that expectation is implicit in his choice of subject matter. Ovid's Metamorphoses was well known, and the Orpheus story within it was so popular that it is even referenced in L'Amphi Parnasso 6 years before Eurydice's premiere. The wedding ceremony is never referenced directly, but it would be known from context that Eurydice and Orfeo were both celebrating separately after the ceremony had already taken place. More importantly, those familiar with Ovid's version of the story would know its tragic ending, foreshadowed by Hymen, the god of weddings, being unable to give the marriage its proper blessing despite his presence. In Rinuccini's version, no mention of a blessing or lack thereof is part of the story. In addition, Rinuccini omits the ascent of Orfeo and Eurydice from the underworld. Rinuccini does not portray an alternate version of the tragic events, a lack of blessing, unsuccessful ascent from the underworld, in order to support his happy ending, but rather excludes them from his telling entirely. For both L'Amphi Parnasso and Eurydice, the lengthy nature of sung text led the librettists to exclude details in dialogue that they would otherwise present in a spoken version of the story. The elongated nature of sung text requires librettists and composers to make decisions not only about how much text to include, but also how that text should be set. The complete narrative unfolds through the interactions between the characters. In the case of opera, individual singers representing characters. In the case of madrigal comedy, groups of singers representing individual characters. The musical dialogue of Eurydice, which was composed by Peri for the premiere, is in stile rappresentativo, which modern audiences would hear as recitative. There is very little internal repetition of text. This efficient delivery of dialogue allows for extended treatment, including ritornello, in the choral movements. When Rinuccini assigns the chorus a significant amount of text, however, he often writes in strophic poetry. In this case, Peri follows the poetic form, setting it strophically in the music as well. In other instances, Rinuccini indicates a line to be delivered by the choir, or coro. But Peri sets it for a single soloist from within the chorus instead. In the case of Vecchi's dialogue, which is set polyphonically, internal repetition of the text is much more common because of its adherence to common practice for the musical forms of each movement. This internal repetition of individual words or phrases that emphasizes them when they first appear, in contrast to ritornello, also provides continuous momentum within each scene. Vecchi and Rinuccini were able to construct their stories with a brevity of text made possible by their assumptions about the audience's knowledge of either the specific story, in the case of Eurydice, or the elements from which the story is constructed, in the case of L'Amphi Parnasso. Another similarity is the use of multiple poetic and musical forms to create the larger work. The poetic form of the madrigal is used throughout both L'Amphi Parnasso and Eurydice. For this genre, there is no fixed form with regard to number of lines, rhyme scheme, or alternation of lines with regard to total syllabic count. As such, it is one of the most flexible forms for conveying a great amount of text without crossing into prose. The Italian poetic madrigal consists of any sequence of both endecasillabi, 11-syllable, or settenari, 7-syllable, lines, in which the final agogic stress lands on the 10th and 6th syllables respectively. Endecasillabi refers to 11-syllable lines. The most common iteration features 11 total syllables because Italian words typically stress the penultimate syllable. Lines ending with words not stressed on the penultimate syllable are counted based on the final agogic stress landing on the 10th syllable, regardless of total length. Italian prosody also requires elision between two or more vowel sounds within one word and between adjacent words, which impacts the total number of syllables as they're spoken or sung aloud. In musical practice throughout the 16th century, the madrigal text was delivered one line at a time with little repetition. Each line offered the composer a new opportunity to explore the emotional content and convey it musically. When certain lines were repeated, as became more common toward the turn of the century, the repetition created special emphasis of that text. In his libretto for Eurydice, Rinuccini utilized the poetic form of the madrigal for dialogue between characters, and this was manifested musically in stile rappresentativo. For both Eurydice and Parnasso, the librettists employ a poetic shift to indicate that the characters are stepping out of the dialogue, to emphasize a particular emotion and or to feature a certain vocalism. This occurs most commonly in the transition from solo movements to choral movements in Eurydice. A poetic shift away from madrigal to a different form also is employed when a character enters a scene and sings a solo. Following the solo, the madrigal form returns when another character responds. An example of that procedure occurs in the final scene of Eurydice, which begins without Orfeo present. When he joins the action, he sings 7 lines in strict endecassyllabi, a particular discrete form. In this solo, he rejoices about his reunion with his wife. When a soloist from the chorus responds, sharing in his rejoicing, the poetic form returns to the madrigal. In Parnasso, an example of the transition from madrigal form to another within the same scene happens in Act 1. Scene 1, when Hortensia denies Pantaloni's advances and makes fun of him for using a mix of nonsense words and insults in lines of quinari, or 5-syllable lines. In addition to their shared poetic forms, these works also have musical similarities. Rinuccini's choral texts often include strophic poetry and ritornelli, and both Peri and Caccini follow the librettists' forms in their musical settings. The first scene features a ritornello form with alternating sections of new and repeated text. Peri's setting of the ritornello, al canto al ballo, includes imitative polyphonic entrances mixed with contrapuntally enlivened homophony. Caccini's setting of the ritornello, however, resembles the polyphonic compositions of contemporaries like Vecchi in its floridity. Caccini insisted that many of his own settings for the chorus be included in the premiere. Ultimately, the version of a Eurydice that Vecchi heard at the Medici wedding included Caccini's version of the chorus al canto al ballo, which we'll hear today. Caccini scores the chorus canto, quinto, alto, tenore, basso, with the canto and quinto in florid imitative polyphony. Flowing semi-minims are present in the ritornello. The other intervening sections resemble passaggi, ornaments that are typically not written out. Of near constant fusa, a rhythmic subdivision of the semi-minim. However, the music in these selections is fully dictated by Caccini. These types of embellishments are described in his Nuove Musiche, and are no doubt influenced by the vocal practices of the Concerto della Donne and his own experience as a singer. While Caccini is more extravagant in showcasing singers' agility, he is more conservative harmonically than his contemporaries. In scene 2 of Eurydice, Daphne enters and engages in dialogue with Orfeo and his companions. Peri's hexachordal treatment of Daphne's news of Eurydice's death is juxtaposed with the contrasting hexachordal treatment that portrays the merriment of Orfeo and his companions, which Daphne is interrupting. She is slow to share the news of Eurydice, but she is clearly distressed, which allows Orfeo and Arcetro to react to her distress before learning of Eurydice's demise. Daphne enters firmly in the hard hexachord. Using multiple melodic half steps, she also ventures as far as the triply hard hexachord. The first response to her is from Arcetro, who is confused because he just saw Eurydice in a happy state. So his vocal line is set in the natural hexachord. This is paired with the hard hexachord in the basso continuo, which lingers on G, while Arcetro sings a sighing figure on Oi me. The continuo then joins the natural hexachord when Arcetro tells of his recent interaction with Eurydice. The natural hexachord is used to present this liminal state between the happiness they are experiencing and the sadness that Daphne is experiencing. The moment after Archetra's response, the continuo and Daphne return to the hard hexachord. Following that, when Orfeo first responds, he's in the soft hexachord, reflecting the previous merriment. Then reacts with Archetra to Daphne's distress. This back and forth continues with forays into the hard hexachord by Orfeo and Archetro until Daphne finally shares the news of Eurydice's death. She first recounts the beauty of the day and of the bride in the soft hexachord, and only shifts to the hard hexachord once she reaches the phrase sorte acerba, or sour fate. She continues in the hard hexachord, except for in a few small moments. A particular instance of one of these moments is in the phrase fred assai che ghiaccio, or colder than ice, which features an extremely dissonant effect. Daphne sings a B flat that is carried over the tactus or bar line, and the continuo plays a B natural against it on the next beat. The news of Eurydice's death sends Orfeo into shock. To represent this, the melodic line is static, and he remains in the soft hexachord. The continuo only ventures into the hard hexachord for a beat before returning to the soft hexachord with Orfeo. Only when Orfeo says that he cannot cry, as opposed to earlier when he was saying he will not cry, does he finally go into the hard hexachord. His melodic line becomes more active to express his pain. Vecchi uses both expressive harmony and virtuosic vocal writing in L'Amphi Parnasso. Isabella is really in love with Lucio and finds Captain Cardone detestable. Nearly every time she has to speak with Cardone, Isabella is in the hard hexachord. When Cardone visits Isabella, she accuses him of being a sort of womanizer. He takes offense at this and responds in the hard hexachord. He asks why she would accuse him, and she responds that she was jesting to test his loyalty. He responds, asking her not to make these types of jokes. And when she responds, it is set in a rapid, repeated figure in all 5 voices. While she's poking fun at him, the vocal lines are in the soft hexachord, but the individual words like core, heart, and amore, love, are in the hard hexachord because she dislikes him. Vecchi uses this setting of her response to show off not only the agility of the singers, but also the higher extremes of their ranges. Cardone asks Isabella who Isabella loves, and she feels compelled to lie to him to placate him, since he is a more powerful person. She keeps repeating his name, and the different voices singing her text are simultaneously in the hard and soft hexachords to illustrate her duplicity in this moment. Most of the voices are in the hard hexachord, however, conveying her true feelings. Conclusion. Madrigal comedy, particularly L'Amphi Parnasso, does have an important place in the development of choral music. However, it remains an important precursor to opera because of Vecchi's acknowledged influence on early opera composers and because of the shared approaches to dramatic storytelling. Both L'Amphi Parnasso and Eurydice are experiments in setting a drama fully to music. They share that they are vocal genres featuring no spoken dialogue. They have a discrete plot with characters and circumstances that develop throughout the story. They both feature multiple poetic and musical forms in addition to madrigal within a single work, and they share theatrical and vocal origins. They both draw on elements from pastoral theater and other theatrical traditions of the late 16th century. They also share a common model for vocalism and ornamentation in the Concerto delle Donne. Although L'Amphi Parnasso would not have been staged, and Vecchi used multiple voices to represent individual characters, The profound, dramatic, and musical connections speak strongly to Parnasso's important place in the history of opera, and the need for it to be represented as such in the continued story of opera. Thank you. Now, before we continue to the musical portion of this presentation, I would like to take a moment to thank those who have supported me on this journey. First, I would like to thank God, to whom all glory goes now and forever. To my family and friends watching in person and on the live stream, thank you for your support of my educational journey through continued prayer and love. To the music and theater educators from my K-12 upbringing in North Clackamas and at the Oregon Bach Festival, my success stands on a foundation that you all helped to build. To former faculty and colleagues at Central Washington University and the University of Hawaii at Manoa, you have been integral to my journey to get to this point. To the staff of the University of Arizona School of Music, I am constantly grateful for your help and patience, and especially to Rick Woodruff, who tuned this harpsichord, Carson Scott, Reed Ferris, Rick Chavez, Sally Day, Todd Polstra, Chris Allen, and the many student workers who also tolerate my antics. Thank you to the director of the School of Music, Dr. Lori Wiest, for your financial support and your being just a good friend. Thank you to my friends and colleagues in the School of Music. Thank you to Recital Choir for singing for me in this process. Thanks especially for all of the work that many of you have done outside of regular rehearsals, including the soloists and keyboardists. To the faculty, from whom I've learned so much, thank you for your scholarship. To UA Opera and the members of my minor committee, Professor Cynthia Stokes and Dr. Jay Rosenblatt, thank you for letting me pop into your offices so often, which are conveniently located next to the study rooms. To my early music boys with a Z, Dr. John Brobeck and Dr. Jeff Vanderlee, thank you for modeling an enduring love for and interest in this time period, its repertoire, and all the baggage that comes with it. It's nice to know that spark stays alive past grad school and well into a career. Thank you for also serving on my committee. To Dr. Elizabeth Schauer, thank you for modeling collegiality and ethics to the utmost. I've learned so much from you in lectures and rehearsals and lessons, but most of all in the interactions that are not strictly educational. I am impressed by your commitment to growth and change when it serves your students and the profession at large. There are so many lessons you have taught me that I have taken to heart, and even more, that I will remember when I need to be reminded of them in the future. Finally, to the person who has paid the rent for all of grad school, my wife, Natalie Riggs, over the last 5 years, you have been my scribe, my study partner, my brain before 7 a.m., my travel companion, and my whole heart, and 1,000 other things. You are an incredible musician and music educator. I learn more about teaching every day I'm with you. Your students are the luckiest in the world. You were willing to step in to sing recits when someone had to step away, despite having no time to do so and being very pregnant. You are one of the most intellectually and emotionally intelligent people I have the joy of knowing. Thank you for growing our baby boy, the reason why we are both doing so much work to be the best we can be personally and professionally. I love you so much. Let's go home. A program note for this evening. We will not be singing Rallegrate vi Mecca, and so we will go straight on to the next piece after that. I would now like to welcome the singers of Recital Choir and the soloists to the stage and backstage. Thank you.
Amen. Amore, non so per qual sentiero, scorsemi di Pluton nel vasto impero. Più lieto assai, imper giardin donzella. Come tu pure legge, nudo il peccato tappa testi. Modior savior vesti, fervidi preghi, flegili sospiri, temprai si dolci ch'io, nell'implacabil cor testai pietate, così